Good morning, everyone. So thank you for joining us today. I'm Mary Boyce. I'm the Dean of Columbia Engineering, and it's my excitement and privilege to introduce our design challenge, Census 2020. And as with our earlier design challenges, this topic is very timely, and in this case, it's also very local and so highly important to New York. From our earliest beginnings as a school and as a university, Columbia has been engaged with the important issues that face New York City, from public health to transportation to infrastructure and to policy. And today, we have the opportunity to become engaged with making sure that every New Yorker gets counted. So as you know, the US Census happens every 10 years. Maybe you didn't know that, but it happens every 10 years. And much is at stake. Each year, our federal government allocates more than, how many dollars do you think? How many, yes, no, you know too much, Ken. You're not allowed to. Okay, how many billion dollars a year do you think? $700 billion for public education, public housing, Head Start, senior centers, and other critical programs based on the results of the census. The results of the 2020 census also affect our electoral representation in the US House of Representatives, and hence New York's electoral votes. That's pretty critical these days. The response rates in New York City in 2000 and in 2010 were roughly 62%, which is significantly below the national average of 76%. And New York's Office of the Census also reports that in 2010, close to 2 million children in New York went uncounted. So in order to make sure that our city, our neighborhoods, our communities receive their fair share of funding, we need accurate data. And this is a data-driven society now, so we need this data to be accurate and correct. And so this is where you come in. This is what this challenge is about. We want you to help figure out how we get more New Yorkers counted. What are the obstacles to participation? How can we make the process easier and more effective? How can we empower communities to take action amongst themselves? This year, there's also other changes happening, that there's going to be electronic and mobile ways for every person to submit to the census. Right? So this provides new opportunities, but it also provides new challenges, right? Because some people are not going to be familiar with how do we use these technologies to actually get our input counted. A hallmark of our design challenges is that they're highly interdisciplinary. So we have invited students from across the university. We have faculty participation from across the university to bring different thoughts, different points of view, different perspectives, different talents and skills together to be addressing this important issue. This is also a wonderful time to learn more about and practice what's referred to as design thinking, and you'll hear from experts in this area today as well. We have several university faculty members here, as well as alumni, who are eager to assist you in the process as advisors as you pursue your solutions. They'll help you refine your strategy, hone in on the main issues and challenges, and review your project as your ideas develop. And for the first time, we are also offering opportunity to do the design challenge within some sort of curriculum framework. This will help you manage your time, okay, and use this in a way that actually helps and doesn't divert from your studies. So for example, Professor Chris Wiggins has an applied math seminar which will have projects within in that course. Professor Brian Smith in his user interface design course, Professor Lydia Chelton in her advanced web design studio, and also a special seminar class with Professors Harry West and Professor Lydia Chelton focused on this design challenge. You'll hear more about that during the sessions here. So if you want to take this as part of a class, this is a great opportunity. The challenge is an example of how a human-centered design, co-production, and technology, all these fields can be used together to serve the public good. So this will help you become some of the pioneers in the emerging area of civ tech, so our civic good and technology put together. Working with the Census Office, utilizing public data sets to solve this very important community challenge. What you accomplish in this challenge can really have a very direct impact on the lives of New Yorkers and for a very long time to come. Those of you who are from outside our engineering school may or may not be aware that in engineering we have a vision that guides us, is that our engineering efforts are directed to have an impact on human lives, on humanity. We refer to this as Columbia Engineering for Humanity. This design challenge is absolutely aligned with this, and we know that, you know, our faculty and students from across Columbia really want to bring their knowledge, their talents to actually serve society and humanity as well. So we think this is very much in the spirit of Columbia University. I'd like to thank the Office of Census in New York. So New York City has a specific office focused on the 2020 census, and we'll hear from experts from that office today. And I'd like to thank our speakers and panelists, the faculty from across the university who are here to share their thoughts and ideas and expertise with you today. So again, it's my pleasure to kick this off, and let's get started on Design Challenge Census 2020. Okay.
All right, so to kick us off, I'm very happy to introduce Kenneth Pruitt. Ken is the Carnegie Professor of Public Affairs, that's at SEPA. He's also been a director of the United States Census Bureau, so what better expert to have than that? Before joining Columbia, he taught political science at the University of Chicago and has also been faculty at several universities, including Stanford, Washington University, University of Nairobi, and the graduate faculty at the New School, where he was also dean. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Academy of Political and Social Science, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and member of other professional associations, including the Council on Foreign Affairs. He has a BA from Southern Methodist University and an MA from Washington University, and also attended Harvard Divinity School as a Danforth Fellow and holds a PhD from Stanford. He's also authored and co-authored a number of books and is currently completing Counting the Races of America, Do We Still Need to, Do We Still Want to? Please come up.
This is a remarkable effort by the engineering school and colleagues beyond that. And so I really do applaud it. There are 3 censuses going on right now. One is the operational census. We have it every 10 years, and that has all the features that, of course, the design will want to focus. How do you mobilize? How's the technology going to work? And I'll get back to the operational census in a moment, briefly, because you've got an expert coming in from the Census Bureau, and she can do it in much more detail, but it's important. Normally, at this stage of the game, when we're talking about the census, that's what we talk about, and the only thing we talk about. We're also talking under that umbrella, are we going to have a good shot at recruiting the people we need to go out into the neighborhoods and do the counting after the fact? What's the response rate going to be? What's the magnitude of the personnel that you'll be using? How well is the technology going to work? A bunch of stuff associated with the operation of the census itself. The second census is a partisan census. We've actually never had one of those. We don't know quite how to deal with one of those. We have discussion now I was last night at a different event with Mark, where the other person on the podium was Congresswoman Maloney. And she couldn't have been more partisan and forcefully angry about what she sees the Republicans as doing. The census has an important criteria or feature with respect to the partisanship dimension of this. The better the count, the more complete the count, the better it is for the Democrats. Just a fact. Has nothing to do with the fact that they're Democrats. It's just the populations that we don't count or that we have an undercount of are disproportionately Democratic. So if you get more to the end of the census, you're going to you can't refute that fact. We don't say it out loud very often, but anyone who's in the game knows it. So you're never free of partisanship, but this particular census has been, the whole citizenship question was debated around the benefit to the Democratic Party, the Republican Party. So the vocabulary of this census is much more partisan than has ever been true. I'll just give you one quick example. I turned to Congresswoman Maloney last night, who I know very, very well. She was this person in the committee that oversaw the 2000 census that I was director of. And I said, can you imagine between now and April, President Trump and the leadership in the House and the leadership in the Senate from the Democratic Party being on a platform together and saying, the census matters for America, everyone should cooperate? Can you just imagine that happening? And she said, no. We've always had that. We've always had a cross-party agreement. Everybody wants good numbers. And the commercial sector certainly wants good numbers, and the commercial sector is disproportionately, quote-unquote, Republican and those kinds of things. So the partisanship part of this is really, really messy. And how you design with that as part of your strategy takes much more than I can give to it right now, but it's just there. Then the third census we're going to have, probably, is a disinformation campaign. We've never had that. We've never had people going out and deliberately trying to destabilize the census. So that's a whole new game. And then against all of that, I want to make one important point. The census happens fast. It happens fast. It doesn't take place fast. It starts taking place. Actually, we started planning the 2000 census, the 2020 census in 2010, do experts and do experiments in 2010 that feed into the design of 2020. The census itself takes a long time, and then there's the enormously long time of cleaning up at the end. You're down to the last 2 or 3%. You're trying to find those people, knocking on doors, doing other kind of mechanisms to find those people and so forth. You're into May, but the actual experience of the census is from roughly March 20th to roughly April 10th, something like that. The advertising commitment campaign begins to hit the media in a big way. It starts earlier. I started in 2000 by going to Alaska and getting on a dog sled and counting the first person in the census. We always do Alaska, by the way, in January because you can't do it after the melt because you can't move around the country very well. So we actually do that count there. So that front page of the newspapers and blah, blah, blah. So you started with an advertising campaign, a general awareness campaign. The census is coming and it matters. But then as you get closer and closer, you begin to target that advertising, both demographically and geographically. But still, it's an advertising campaign. It's not the census the way that people begin to feel. Then you get the form. And then you know it's there. If you do get it, if the mails work, the whole apparatus is in place. But from that date until you actually see a real, you counted however many you're going to count within about a 2 to 3 week period, which means fighting a disinformation campaign, it's not like fighting in the election, which started long before the election itself. And so you had some sort of time, though we had no success in the series, but we learned a lot of things in 2016 about disinformation. So you have to build into the design something that, if you want to tackle the disinformation campaign, which is got to be kind of alert to and ready to go almost immediately. And then what? What's that mean? How many doors in New York can you knock on to say, oh, what you just got through the mail is a false form, wasn't even the census form, pay no attention to it. How do you get that message out? Anyway, I hate to leave you with that challenge, but it's not to be avoided. So the design itself has got to take all three of these things into consideration. There are other things that are less visible, but they're equally important. There is, and I'm glad that Mark is here, there is a thing called differential privacy. There is levels of public trust. That's one of the other dimensions in this census. Much higher levels of mistrust of the government, period, not the census as such, but simply of the government or dislike of the government. We don't want to cooperate with the government, and so forth and so on. And as part of that is the surveillance state. Why do they need to know all of this about us? The census form itself has got 10 questions. We already know the answer to every one of those for most of the American population anyway, and other kinds of places that we get data. And we will get data, a lot of data this time when we have to from the administrative records of the federal government to fill in the blanks. We'll probably have a good census, but it won't be in a field census. It'll be a census that gets, at the end of the day, statistically and other kinds of arrangements will make it a good census, or at least an acceptable census. But differential privacy is a very, very complicated but very, very smart strategy, but it's caused an enormous negative buzz out there. One, that people don't understand it. Why isn't it already private? Why are you doing all this kind of stuff? And so forth. So that's not quite in the same arena, public arena, but it's an undertone of this. The lack of trust in the census is already high, just because of the enormous debate that we had about whether to put the citizenship question in or not. So as you approach your task, there's no precedent for it. There are more balls in the air today than there were in previous censuses, just are. And so you can't take the successes of 2010 and the successes of 2000, both of which are very good censuses, had very high response rates, ended up with a few people undercounted and a few people overcounted, but nothing like the censuses earlier than that. Partly because the 2000 census was the first census to do a paid advertising campaign. And what we called a partnership program, big partnership, thousands and thousands of people partnering, complete count committees. Now, I leave you with one thing which you fortunately can ignore, because you're only going to do New York. And New York itself is putting money into the census in the neighborhood of $80 million, I heard the other day. Is that 40? 40 million? Okay, well then somebody was doubling it already. So, yeah. Oh, then just in New York City is 40, yeah. California's putting in over 100 million of its own money into the census. For the reasons that Mary mentioned. There's a lot of money at stake, there's a lot of power, and especially in New York, there's a sense of, I want the people I feel like I'm close to, my colleagues, my friends, my ethnicity, my race, I want us to have a big number, because the bigger our number is, the more we claim we can make on the society and on its resources and so forth. So an undercount of any given demographic group really hurts that group in those neighborhoods. So it's not just the immediate money, and it's not just the seats in Congress and so forth, but it's also the sense of belonging. And if some groups feel like they don't belong and they're not going to cooperate, and that's certainly true, of course, of the undocumented, and families any family which has an undocumented in the family is treated almost by the Census Bureau as it is undocumented, because that's going to infect the levels of cooperation and trust. But I want to just quickly finish on that issue. I really am sad to see the amount of money that states and localities are putting into the census, because not all of them can do it. And therefore, you, by definition, are creating an unfair census. If a state spends $100 million, another state spends zero, guess what? Some of the money that state should have gotten, it's got schools, it's got VA hospitals, it's got so forth, and that money is going to go to California or to New York City, because we're putting a lot of money in it to do a complete count. That's just a thing that hangs over your head. You don't have to be responsible for it, but it's an odd development, if you will. that what should be a federal government obligation now has to turn into be a state and local obligation. But that is true. You will have complete count committees, all kinds of things going on. New York City as a place to work on the census is enormously fun. One of the smartest people in urban census taking and all the stuff that goes, a man named Joe Salvo, who's just is a prince at all this stuff, and you will sooner or later engage with him if you start down this track. He knows where everybody lives in this city. He knows how many basement apartments there are that aren't supposed to be apartments, but there is a family living down there and so forth and so on. He's been doing that kind of work. So you start with a much richer address file than almost anybody else in the country has, and the deep commitment of the leadership of the city. So those are big assets. Good luck.
Thank you very much, Ken. Up next, we have Mark Hansen. So I'll briefly introduce him and then ask him to come up. Mark is the director of the Brown Institute for Media Innovation and professor in the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, where he teaches advanced data analysis and computational journalism. As a noted statistician, Hansen has been working at the intersection of data, art, and technology, particularly in the presentation of data for the public for nearly 3 decades. His collaborations have been exhibited at such places as the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Whitney, the London Science Museum, the Cartier Foundation in Paris, and the lobby of the New York Times building. He joined Columbia in 2012 after many years at UCLA. He was co-PI for the Center for Embedded Networked Sensing, an NSF Science and Technology Center devoted to the study of sensor networks. Prior to UCLA, Hansen was a member of the technical staff at Bell Laboratories. He's also a longstanding visiting researcher at the New York Times R&D Lab, was a late career intern at the Marshall Project, and a consultant with HBO Sports. He holds a BS in Applied Math from University of California, Davis, and a PhD and MA in Statistics from University of California, Berkeley. Did you have something you would like to add?
Really. Thank you for inviting me to speak this morning. It is always heartening to see so many people out to talk about the census. Somehow, Ken, you probably everywhere you go, the same situation. You want to get people involved and engaged, and it's great that the engineering school is putting so many resources behind this. I should say that when I was in graduate school, I helped out with the census. It was 1992, and the Commerce Department was being sued by a group of big cities who said that there was a known differential undercount of minorities living in big cities, and a group from Berkeley, where I was apparently 3 decades ago. I've got to take that out of my bio. But a group of my advisors at Berkeley were asked to evaluate the adjustment procedure that was being suggested to try to accommodate for that undercount, to try to correct the undercount statistically. It was the first time that I saw the titans of my field, like John Tukey on one side, and then the faculty members, the people I looked up to at Berkeley on the other side, like battling it out. And I thought, how is it possible? Statistics is math, or at least as I'd experienced it, and math had a right and a wrong. There was a true and a false. It was established or it wasn't, but this had, they were arguing about it, and these were people that I trusted, and it really shook me to the core. But anyway, fast forward some number of decades, and here we are with the design challenge of the 2020 census. Chris has asked me just to talk about some of the directions that engineering might go, and I gave it my best shot. You will probably hear from much smarter people over the course of the day, but I gave it my best. So first of all, as Ken's made clear, the census is an important part of the political, economic, and civic life of our nation. It's facing serious challenges, and there's plenty of room for good engineering work to take place. Now, as a journalist or as having been in a journalism in Pulitzer Hall for the last 7 years, rather, this work, I should comment that this work needs to be focused on helping guarantee an accurate count and should be conducted in partnership with stakeholders. It sounds like you have those stakeholders in hand, and that is part of the way engineering is practiced here. But that means that from a practical perspective, algorithms, whether it's AI or machine learning or whatever, should be all explainable. They should be applied in ethical ways. Any public-facing products should be vetted so they help and not harm the effort. And the project should equalize rather than reinforcing gaps, right? I should also note that you're not going it alone. In short, good engineering principle, look to good engineering principles and build responsibly, which I know you will. I should also note that you're not going it alone. There are many groups of various stripes participating, from civil society groups to Get Out the Count organizations, journalists, academics of all kinds. They're there to help you, right? They're there to help you explain why the census is important, how it becomes the denominator in so many fractions and rates, and we'll talk a little bit more of this in a bit. And Ken, if I say anything while you just slap me or something, is that okay? I would say too that my own background in this is in the privacy protections that the Census Bureau will put after all the data's been collected, so that if any of you are interested in that aspect, just drop me some email or something and we can talk about that. I did want to mention that the census itself is currently undergoing a kind of engineering sprint. The 2020 census sprint is happening at this moment, and I believe you all can participate in this if you start to form groups. I bring this up maybe not so much for the participation angle, although it would be great if you could, but also because they break down areas that they see as important for getting out the count, places where groups of computer scientists, engineers can help establish the count. And these are my favorite kinds of slides that have lots of tiny text, so the guy squinting in the background, I apologize, but I like the wallpaper. Anyway, so the first, and we'll go through these in a little bit of detail. The first is bridging the digital divide. As Ken had mentioned, this is the form that you will get in the mail will direct you to a website where you will fill out the census form online. For those parts of the country where there isn't access to broadband, that this is something you're going to want to think about. Increasing digital literacy. There's a concern that it's going to be really easy for people to circulate bogus URLs that people will just click through and start to give away way too much information, right? As Ken said, the census is like 10 questions, and it's not asking things like income or how many toilets in your house or those sorts of things that other surveys they offer do. It's also, civil society groups have started using this term inoculation. So rather than sort of directly, or maybe hoping to avoid having to directly combat misinformation, which we'll talk about in a second, perhaps you can inoculate the population by having them understand how important the census is, so that when something comes along, they're going to weigh the piece of misinformation and maybe be a little more critical of that piece of misinformation because they understand the importance of the census, and you've done a good job of explaining that to them in advance. Enumerator outreach and recruitment I'm going to skip, and then reaching hard to count communities is something that I think is, again, an area where we might offer some engineering help. And on the hard to count topic, there are lots of maps and lots of tools out there that you can start to look at. This is sort of hard to count regions as computed by sort of mailback rates from the 2010 census. So you can go into this website and just have a look at where there are regions where, enumerators had to go out and talk to people. In our own neighborhoods, you can start to see, what the response rate was, and perhaps we can do something about that. Maybe that's something you start to engineer. The census itself also offers something called ROAM, the Response Outreach Area Mapper, which looks at not just response rates from 2010, but brings in a lot of other demographic variables. So as Ken mentioned, children under 5 are hard to count. So this will give you a sense of like who's hard to count, where are they living, what might I do about that? Okay, so some of the work that you can do is around thinking about sort of hard to count populations, identifying them, figuring out how to improve accuracy there. One of the advantages of being in New York is that a lot of the data is just easily available. So every census tract, every census block, if you need mapping information, all of that stuff is available through the open data portal. So you are in an amazing place to be collecting and working with lots and lots of public data. The population division that Joe Salvo heads, that Ken mentioned, also puts out a population fact finder, which is a really beautiful interface to the census data for New York City, where you can actually sort of lasso some area, some neighborhood. It doesn't have to be an existing piece of the census hierarchy from block to block group to tract and so on. But let's say we just circled an area here. It's a little hard to see. This is just sort of some random collection of blocks that I pulled together, but it'll then summarize the statistics for that region for you and put everything complete with margins of error if it's one of the other census projects or products. I should mention, by the way, we're talking specifically at the moment about the decennial census, right? That's the thing that happens every 10 years. You will often see news stories that talk about the Census Bureau reports, right? Anything that has to do with income, anything that has to do with sort of something other than these 10 questions that we're talking about, like your sex or your age or your ethnicity, those are probably coming from what's called the American Community Survey, which is what used to be the long form of the census. It used to be that what percent was it? 1% of the population got the long form? 17%. Wait. All right, so 17% of the population used to get this long form that asked lots and lots of questions, and everyone else got the short form. Now everyone gets the short form, and the long form's been transitioned more or less to this American Community Survey, which is takes a lot more data. Okay. Anyway, so the population fact finder from New York City is a great resource. I'm going to take a second and give a little bit of airtime to the project we're working on. It's called News Counts, and it's maybe journalists' approach to engineering and helping the census achieve a more accurate count. What we're hoping to do is help local news organizations tell better stories about the census. Why does the census matter to some city in Montana? Why does being counted accurately matter in the end? Dean Boyce suggested at the beginning that and I've heard variously between 625 and $800 billion are going to come back to the states in the next 10 years, depending on the counts. That's a huge number per year. That's a huge number, made now huger because it's not divided by 10. Thank you. That's a huge number, but it's also abstract. It's a huge number, but it's also abstract. So what does that mean to our communities, right? What does it mean to our particular community? Why is the census important? And we've, under the News Counts program, we'd like to partner local, state, university, college, sort of academics with newsrooms to help identify what good stories, can they tell? And here's some examples. This comes from Sydney Herald in, I believe it's in Richland County, and a part of Montana. And the story here is about how census counts allowed the community to qualify for funds to conduct a particular kind of cancer research, and the community wouldn't have qualified for that cancer research had the at-risk population not been deemed big enough. So if you didn't count enough people, they wouldn't have qualified for the funds to conduct the medical research that is the second leading cause of death in their community, right? And so for them, getting counted means that this research can take place, right? So here's an important local story that takes some of these abstract, notions of representation or notions of like these large sums of money coming back and makes it very specific. Or Jersey Shore Online, again, another local news outlet, a portion of that article refers to the fact that, like, how many different programs depend, like, from sort of national school lunch programs, Section 8 housing, infrastructure improvements, especially post-Hurricane Sandy. All these things we're looking to the census for assessments of how much money should be allocated. This is a bit of notes to myself. The stories that you might see in local news outlets now, though, at this moment tend to be a little procedural. So they're saying, look, people are coming through neighborhoods to check addresses. They're also commenting that people are being hired now to be enumerators, because the Census Bureau hires people from the neighborhood to go out and try to count people who haven't filled in their forms. One of the problems that we're facing with the News Counts project is that if we want to have better stories told, we're sort of depending on there being a vibrant local media, right? And at the moment, the economics around journalism are such that lots of local outlets are drying up. And so there are what are called news deserts opening up in lots of places. So how do you start to do that kind of reporting, but in places where the news outlets are disappearing? And it's not just that there's a paper in some city, but if you think about the booming Hispanic population in western Kansas, right, you need some kind of ethnic media as well, and not just that there's a paper in western Kansas that's responding, but you might, you know, there's the desert has, the concept of a desert has a demographic dimension to it as well to make it a little bit more complicated. So Ken had alluded a couple times about misinformation. This was a piece that appeared in Reuters a little while ago. And specifically at the ways in which the census is looking toward Facebook, Twitter, and Google to maybe help them when it comes to misinformation about the census that might act to suppress or to encourage people to not fill out their forms, right? So to add to a sort of already heightened level of mistrust of the census. I was actually at one of these meetings, and it was interesting to watch how Google, Facebook, and Twitter responded to the request that they treat, like, how are you going to treat misinformation about the census? And Google said, well, we just don't allow misinformation on our platform. That's just crazy. What are you talking about, right? And Facebook's response was, well, we just hired 10,000 more moderators, so we're okay. And Twitter's like, it's really not our job to adjudicate truth. We're just here to have authentic conversations, right? And I was just like, how? But Facebook has taken a big step, and they've said that they're going to treat misinformation on the census in the same way that they would treat misinformation around an election, which is a very interesting turn. So what that means exactly, I don't know that that's been hashed out, but that's an interesting turn. The citizenship question and other public debates have put people on edge about the census and its security and the privacy of your data. In this environment, some groups then are worrying about misinformation campaigns to suppress participation. Here's a kind of example, and you can find a few of them that sort of surface from time to time that just sort of say the wrong thing. In this case, Charlie Kirk is commenting on Obama was the first president in 190 years to not include a citizenship question on his census, which just isn't right, but anyway, so the response from a group of civil society groups was this tweet: Trump backed down and the people won, never in the census's 230-year history as the government, and so on, okay? So there was a response. But the question is, how do you respond to this campaign without accident? And this is where the engineering trick comes in. How do you respond to a campaign like this without accidentally amplifying a message that would otherwise go unheard? Right? So if this person happens to have a fair number of followers, but if something appears and you see that 10 people saw it, you probably shouldn't have some national organization retweeting and commenting on it, right? It might be fine to just let it stand and not talk about it. Because as soon as you talk about it, you bring all your followers along with you. And if you're like the New York Times and they're talking about it, suddenly somebody has a megaphone that they didn't have before, and you're amplifying the message. And that's a really, really difficult problem. So number one, it's not clear the extent to which misinformation is going to be a problem. But number two, whatever you do, please make sure that we respond responsibly to campaigns like this. We look very carefully and we decide that something is happening here, and then we respond, right? Not that, oh, this seems wrong, and it was wrong to all 10 of this person's followers, so I better get in there and correct it, right? Just let it go, right? Twitter and the internets in general are a horrible place, and there's lots of corners of horrible things that go on, and you don't try to correct all of them, you just correct the big ones, right, that are going to have a problem. So, and there are groups that are going out that are organizing around how do we have a response, right? What should our response look like? And you might be able to help in that regard. I just wanted to temper the misinformation angle because you'll hear a lot about it, but I want to temper it with a degree of responsibility. So monitoring tools to assess the impact of posts on social media seem important. Then a source of data that you probably won't get this semester, but will start next year when the census gears up, are real-time response rates. According to the Bureau, I talked to my friend yesterday, every day, probably in the afternoon, data is going to be published via the Census API about the current response rates. These are going to be fractions of household in each track that have completed their census form. This is something that we haven't had before. So you'll be able to say day after day after day, and this is going to be for basically every track essentially every track in the United States. There are some that are sort of too small and there's privacy concerns, but it's 115,000 unique geographies down to the track level will be reported daily. And so what you have is 115,000 time series, right, that you can watch day by day what's happening. Hopefully, I mean, they're always going to go up, right, but are some going up quickly or some not? We've just launched a new Get Out the Count campaign. Can we see its effect on the daily counts, right? There's interesting engineering there that can go on around that data. So I leave you then with these four topics as areas that you might want to get involved in. I believe you can participate still in this 2020 census sprint. It started a little bit earlier in the year, but I talked to the head of it and she seemed excited to have groups of students join. The thing that it provides you is further access to census experts. You already have access through New York City, but this would provide you sort of other people to talk to as well. And I guess I'm going to just leave it there and see if there's any questions in the next 4 minutes. Yes?
Hi. I wanted to follow up on your point about misinformation and not amplifying a message when there aren't that many followers. Where do you draw the line in terms of deciding if the number of followers, for example, is big enough that you would want to combat the misinformation?
Right.
How big is big?
Yeah. My feeling is that some things shouldn't be operationalized via thresholds, right? So I would hate to put some sort of robotic system in place that said a tweet that looks weird is has this many followers, so go, right? Because there are, as you know well, not everyone on Twitter is a person, right? Many of them are zombified and are acting at the behest of others. So they're robots that are, doing so. 10,000 doesn't mean 10,000 real people. 10,000 that live in an alt-right bubble of some kind. Also, probably not reasonable to try to defend against that because you're not changing anybody's opinion there, right? So it's my feeling that these kinds of questions should always be looked at in conjunction with stakeholders, with civil society groups, with other groups that have been doing work in this area. You will not be the first ones, if you pick up misinformation, you will not be the first ones to be doing this, and it would be better to plug into those, and I can help you do that, but like plug into those existing efforts. There is a real lack of researchers who civil society groups can ask questions of, right? People who can look at a trace and say, gosh, half of the locations that are assigned to these tweets are from Moldova or something, right? Like this doesn't seem right. So they need experts who can assess whether or not this is real or this is some sort of a weird campaign, right? And so I would not, I've spent too much airtime on a topic I didn't want to spend that much airtime on. But I want to underscore being careful here, because you don't want to end up being the one who tipped something off that you didn't want to. Thank you so much for your attention.
So I'm very pleased to be introducing Julie Menon, who is the director of the Census for New York City. So Julie Menon is an attorney and civic leader who has over 2 decades of experience in the legal, regulatory, and public sectors. She also brings years of experience organizing, advocating, and securing funding in nonprofit, private, and government sectors. Some of her important work is in the redevelopment of Lower Manhattan in the wake of 9/11. And in addition, Menon chaired the Community Board 1 for 7 years in the aftermath of 9/11 and was a strong vocal advocate for the community. During her time as a chair, she spearheaded the approval of the Islamic Cultural Center and Mosque. She also served as a commissioner for the Redistricting Commission in 2001, where she led a nonpartisan effort to set a new city council district lines. It's our pleasure to welcome Julie so we can hear the New York side of the story.
Well, thank you so much. I am thrilled to be here. So I have a really strong connection to Columbia. I graduated from Columbia College. I was the 3rd class of women. I also served as an adjunct professor, both at SEPA, at the law school, and now I'm on the board of trustees at Columbia. So I'm really happy to be back now in a slightly different capacity. So I really want to thank you, Dean, because you have been a terrific partner to us in the census in terms of your passion for it, your dedication to it, and your willingness, honestly, to partner with the city of New York on what we feel is one of the most vital challenges that we face. And Eric as well, I really want to thank you for your leadership and all the help that you have given us in terms of this partnership. So I'm really here to tell you what's at stake in terms of the census. We have an unprecedented challenge here in New York City. And for those of you that are card players, perhaps the best analogy I would say is we've been dealt a very bad hand in New York. And we've been dealt a very bad hand in New York for a couple different reasons. First of all, as you probably know, the Trump administration added originally a citizenship question to the census. I wear 2 hats in city government. I'm also executive assistant, corporation counsel at the law department. We were a plaintiff on the case. We went to the Supreme Court. We won our case at the Supreme Court, which is fantastic, and the citizenship question is indeed off the census. The bad news is that President Trump has continued to tweet that the question is indeed on the census. And while many of us know that we won the lawsuit, the people that we need to reach in New York City, the hardest to count neighborhoods, largely do not know that we won that lawsuit. And they do not know that the citizenship question is not on the census. So we have to undo all this damage that has been wrought. The other couple reasons why we've been dealt a bad hand in New York City is what was the intent behind the citizenship question? The citizenship question was an attempt to intimidate immigrant communities and communities of color, not just in New York City, but quite frankly, all across the United States. And the reason why is because if immigrant communities do not answer the census, and we know that cities in general have much higher proportion of immigrant communities. So for example, in New York City, we have 3.2 million immigrants. These areas tend to be blue Democratic strongholds. So what areas then end up picking up more funding and more congressional representation? Largely red Republican states. So I mention that because there's a lot at play in terms of the political wins here with this census. And so it's very important to note that because that's sort of what we're up against. Now, why is all of this so important? It's so important because we're fighting for our fair share of over $650 billion. Yes, $650 billion that the federal government allocates each and every year all across the country to municipalities and to states. This funding goes to over 200 vital programs. So everything from public education, public housing, Medicaid, senior centers, Head Start programs. There's almost no program that any of you could, shout out. I'm not encouraging you to shout out a program that is not linked to how we do on the census. And so that's why it's not an embellishment to say the most significant issue that is facing the future of New York City for the next decade is indeed the census, because everything depends on it. Now, the other thing that depends on how we do on the census is the political representation piece. So we will lose 2 congressional seats statewide if there is a real undercount. And that has real repercussions, obviously, because no community should be underrepresented, of course. It also has repercussions in terms of the balance of the Electoral College, because again, if cities and areas that have large immigrant communities are afraid to respond to the census, then red Republican areas will pick up more congressional seats, and it will indeed change the balance of the Electoral College for many, many years to come. Now, the other reason that we've been dealt a very challenging situation in New York, and I know this was probably discussed in the earlier presentation, is the fact that for the first time the census is online. So this is great news, but it's also bad news. So the positive is by having the census for the first time being online, it will mean that you can literally take out your phone and fill the census out in 2 minutes. That's incredible. It also is exciting because we've negotiated an agreement with the federal government where during the self-response period, which is mid-March to mid-May, we are every single day going to get real-time data by census tract or by neighborhood on how every neighborhood is doing. So Williamsburg, Brooklyn, we're going to be able to say, you're at 2%, Upper West Side, you're at 5%, and we're going to show that data on our website every single day. And the reason that's so important is because we need to literally light a fire under people's, all across the city of New York, to answer the census. Because in 2010, the city's self-response rate was 61.9%. 61.9%. The national average is 76%. So we were woefully under-responsive in terms of the census. And certain communities, Brooklyn was at 55.5%, one of the lowest numbers in the country. So we can and must do better. Now, the challenging part of the census being online, quite frankly, is that 1/3 of New York City households don't have access to broadband. It's also challenging because many people might feel uncomfortable answering the census online. So that is indeed one of the challenges that we face, and one of the reasons we were most interested in working with all of you, because we need to get people to fill the form out online. We have to get them over their nervousness or anxiety about filling it out online, and we want to make it as facile as possible for people to be able to do so. We are partnering with the 219 public library branches in New York City, so we gave them $1.5 million to create pop-up centers with computers, with extra staff, because all of our focus group research showed that most people trust their local public library branch the most. That is, schools and libraries are the most trusted sources when people want to get additional information. So we think it's really important that we partner with the public library system. In terms of what we are working on, the City of New York, so this is really an unprecedented effort. The mayor and the city council have allocated $40 million to our office. We're doing really 4 things with that. First, we're organizing a field campaign. So for any of you that are interested in politics, that have ever volunteered on a campaign, this is a campaign like no other, because we need to reach Republicans, we've got to reach independents, we've got to reach Democrats, and we've got to reach people who are not involved in politics at all. We basically have to reach everyone, and that is a challenging situation. We're also disseminating grants to community organizations on the ground that are trusted voices, so they'll be doing a tremendous amount of outreach. We're doing a whole media campaign, TV, radio, print, community and ethnic papers, and most importantly, digital. Digital is our greatest asset because we can literally create an ad and we can have a click-through directly to the link to fill the census out. So there'll be a direct call to action associated with the ad once the self-response period starts. And then we're also going to be partnering, obviously, with all of our various city agencies, Department of Education, schools, to make sure that we're reaching all New Yorkers. So there's so much more I could say about the census. We really are so excited to be working with all of you to get your brain power, your creativity, your ideas. We have to make sure that every neighborhood beats their 2010 number. So the neighborhood, I'll just say this, that had the highest response rate in 2010 in the city of New York was Washington Heights and Inwood at 77.5%. They out-organized everyone else in the city because they understood what was at stake in terms of funding for their community and political representation for their community. So that's the kind of the energy that we need to tap into, and that we need ideas to be able to motivate people and to make sure that people understand that taking the 2 minutes to fill this form out is probably the single most important action they can take that will affect the future of this great city. So I'm going to end on that note, and thank you so much for your time today.
Number of people are going to sit in the form. So that's a design issue. How do you get that number up? But even as Julie said, the best count it was 77%. That's 23% more people that aren't yet counted. So it's a completely different design problem for how do you take people who should have but did not. And that's very different across different demographic groups and geographic parts of the city and so forth and so on. Then you actually end up with what's called the last, end of the line, the last 2 or 3%. You will not likely be able to do anything very serious about that, because that's where the Census Bureau has to really, really dig in, knock on the doors, use statistical ways to make an estimate and so forth. So what you're looking at is that structure of the population, segment of the population, which should have but did not, because they are smart enough or connected enough or whatever to have been part of it, up until the point where it's just the last couple of percent, because you're unlikely to be able to have a design that'll crack that nut. So just think that way as you're designing your design.
So we'll be starting our panel in a few minutes, but I know that people are coming in and out. I want to quickly mention that if you are interested in signing up for this design challenge, you should either register for a class, and you'll hear from all the professors in just a few minutes, and or you should make sure that you are registered for this event. So if you clicked on that Eventbrite link and you registered, or you gave your name to one of us as you came in, then we have your email, and we'll be sending you more information about what the design challenge will entail, how you can participate, what you need to do, all the deadlines, and that kind of thing. If anybody still needs to register, please see me or one of the students helping at lunchtime, and we'll make sure you're on our list so that you can register. Design challenges are a really important, fun, interdisciplinary way to put your skills to use. We've had some really great projects come out of them. I see Ashan sitting here in the back, who was on our winning team from the last design challenge and implemented his project in India. We've seen a lot of really cool projects that have taken off since design challenges and become much bigger than we ever imagined they could be. So these are the check-in points. You'll have 1 week if you want to be participated to figure out your problem statement and team, and you'll be sending back your information to us on Friday, September 13th at 4 o'clock. Then in October, there'll be a midpoint check-in time. And then at the end of the semester, there will be final pitches and more opportunities. Those include ignition grants. So there'll be a special set of ignition grants that you can apply for if you'd like to move forward with this, with the idea you've proposed. You'll hear more about all the courses again in just a minute. So if you're following a track with the courses, you can be in class with the professors and they'll take you through it. Yes. Yes. So you'll be receiving experts as you go. We'll be guiding you through that. Of course, if you're in one of these courses, you'll be guided with the professor of the course, and you'll be hearing from all of them right here. Paul Blair's also in the audience. His classes are so popular, I don't think we need to advertise them more. But Paul's here, so you can also sign up for his class. So with that, I'd like to call up Chris Wiggins, who is professor of applied physics and math and our moderator for the panel of professors. And panel, please make.
So before Chris gets started, I just want to say a few things that from the speakers you've heard so far. You've heard about there's data sets. We're working with the census office here. They will help you get access to those data sets and also how to work with them. It actually is the census, say, SWAT team for New York City is actually located just a few blocks from here. So there's also a nice proximity way to be able to really engage with them in a great way. You also heard about from Mark Hansen, so to think of the context and elements of that in this in your work. And what you're going to hear today, we are thinking of that and how to expose that to you. And you will hear about in design thinking and what's called co-production, how you actually involve the people who are trying to get to the population across New York City that we're trying to make sure fill out the census. How does that get involved together with experts and with yourselves, and how to actually mobilize and get out the vote. And then also working with the technologies that are developed by the government already for filling that out. So unfortunately, Jeanette, we can't change those technologies. We have to work within that confine, which is the question Jeanette had brought up. So anyway, I'm going to hand it over to Chris.
Thank you very much. Okay, good. So I'm Chris Wiggins. I'm a faculty member here in the engineering school. I'm very happy to be moderating this panel. Now that we've heard from several experts about the problems. As mentioned, I'm a professor of applied mathematics. Mark mentioned his experience as a graduate student in the early 90s in statistics, and he said it was a really the experience of working on the census as a technical problem for him as a graduate student really, as he put it, shook him, because statistics and math has a true and a false, and so he was shook, to use his word. But the problem we've outlined here is much more bigger than that. It's really a design problem. So I want to invoke one definition of design, which is design is the intentional solution to a problem within a set of constraints. That is, and for all of us as engineers and designers, to attack that, we need a good understanding of the context, the problem, and the constraints. And so it's important for us to hear directly from the experts, not only to hear from them, but to work with them, to collaborate, and as Dean Boyce put it, to co-create with them solutions that will be effective. Mark also mentioned the importance of responsibility and ethics and having an understanding of the role of rights, harms, and justice in the sense of ethics of human subject research that's going to go into our solutions and our work. So as mentioned, I'm a faculty member. That means I have a representation here for the education function of the university and the research function of the university, which will be a large part of this. As a great university in the city of New York, Columbia also has a civic function, which I think we're all getting to hear from directly, and we're lucky to have experts on our faculty, including the ones you've heard from, and experts from New York City who are willing to make time to be our partners in co-creating these solutions. Us also, as a representative of the faculty, my job is to make sure we leave this room before noon for a class, before 1 p.m. Otherwise, I'm interfering with the education function of this university. And to that end, if I'm brief with the intros, I apologize to the panelists who are all wonderful and highly credentialed, and it is only because time is a factor. To that end, we're lucky to have Amit Baga here, who is the Deputy Director of the New York City Census 2020 office. Amit I'm being approached.
I'm just going to show
Oh, you're going to move on.
slide. You
Oh,
can keep
brilliant.
talking.
As always, thank you, Ivy. So Amit has a long history working with the city. Over the last 11 years, Amit has held several different roles in government, and so we're lucky to have Amit here to help us understand the problem, the intent, the constraints. Lydia Chilton, as mentioned, is a professor here working on HCI and also leading one of the classes. Prior to Columbia, she was a postdoc at Stanford. We're lucky to have Brian, who's also a CS faculty working in HCI, I should say, is human-computer interaction. And Brian is also a proud alumnus of Columbia. We're happy to have him back on the faculty. Harry West is the principal of Invisible Design and also a professor here with a long history in design solutions, and before that, a PhD in mechanical engineering. And I'm Chris Wiggins. So my goal is to make sure that we understand the context and the constraints, and to that end, I'll ask the panelists to not only introduce their role with respect to the census, but first, if I can ask Amit to say a little bit about the problems he sees and the opportunities, and then as Stump the Faculty, then it will be the challenge for the faculty to talk about their educational efforts, their research efforts, and how they have ideas about how Columbia Engineering can meet those problems and constraints. With that, Amit. Thank you for the reminder. Thank you for the reminder. Right. Engineering doesn't exist in a vacuum. Absolutely. So please, Amit, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me here today. Really appreciate it. So as Chris mentioned, my name is Amit Baga. I'm the Deputy Director of NYC Census 2020, which is the office that's led by Julie Menon, who you just heard from. And I'm really glad that Chris talked about thinking about problem solving through through three different lenses, right? Context, problem, and constraints. And so I'm going to speak a little bit about the context, the socio-political, historical, and racial context that really inform the challenges that we face with the census today. The census is, as I'm sure Julie mentioned, right, constitutional obligation of the federal government. It's been conducted every 10 years since 1790. It has never not been conducted. And it really is the collection of data that tells the story of who we are and as a nation, right? Not just how many of us there are, but where we live and how that informs where we're from, and how that all informs the different ways in which the government thinks about allocating resources, allocating political representation, and the like. And so I think it's important for us to remember when we're thinking about tackling this challenge of a lack of a sufficient self-response in the census, to keep in mind that when the census was first done in the late 1700s and the early 1800s, it was built on something that's known as the 3/5 compromise. And those of you who are students of history and politics in the room might know a little bit about this. But the 3/5 compromise was essentially a compromise between different factions of the early United States government that was a giveaway to the southern states. And it was a way for the southern states to essentially say, well, the people that we own at the time as slaves should only count as 3/5 of the population. Because if they were to count fully, that would, in different ways, ultimately take away from their political power that they had. And so when we think about the census and why we have low self-response rates, particularly among African-American communities in the United States, right? This is not something that simply exists in a vacuum. This is built, and the 3/5 compromise, right, is something that obviously is tied to slavery. Slavery is tied to the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement is tied to so much of the sort of conversation that we're having about race and politics, justice and inequality today, right? All of these things are really part of the same historical arc. And so when you look at African-American communities in New York City in particular, and you see that their self-response rates hover about 50%, you dig a little bit deeper into that and you see that those self-response rates actually are the same in African-American communities across socioeconomic lines, right? So it simply isn't a matter of a lack of access to broadband, or it isn't simply a matter of, living in the economic margins of society, right? Southeast Queens is in many ways a middle class or an upper middle class neighborhood, and it had a lower self-response rate than parts of central Brooklyn, where public housing is very heavily concentrated, right? So the economic profiles of these two neighborhoods are incredibly different, but the racial profiles are the same. And so you have to ask yourselves, why is that the case? Why are the self-response rates equally low in both places? And so the historical context is really important here. So I urge all of you in your process when you are taking on this design challenge to keep that type of context in mind. And that is a context that has been set over 300 years of history. You move forward to today, that context is further informed by the fact that there is this constitutional obligation that the federal government has to count us that the Trump administration has been attempting to use as a tool to harm us when it comes to counting and tabulating immigrant communities, right? The citizenship question, the brilliance of it, the unfortunate brilliance of it, is that even if it were to have remained on the census, which it fortunately did not, as I'm sure you heard from Julie, it wouldn't have actually made a difference to anybody in the United States in terms of compromising them as in terms of whether or not they would be deported, in terms of whether or not they would end up having some sort of negative interaction with the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. And why is that the case? It's the case because census data and census information is protected by the strongest federal privacy laws in the books. It's a law known as Title 13. But playing on the lack of information that already exists, playing on the fear that the Trump administration has already sown amongst immigrant communities across the United States, the Trump administration was able to use this idea of the addition of the citizenship question to really strike fear, larger amounts of fear, into the hearts of immigrant communities around the United States, and essentially scare immigrants into the idea was to scare immigrants into not participating. And in doing so, you would artificially depress the number of people that show up on the census in places like New York, in places like California, in places like Texas, Arizona, Florida. And when you do that, you are robbing all of these places that are very heavily immigrant with the political power and the sufficient amount of representation that the Constitution dictates they should have. The Constitution does not talk about citizenship when it references the census. It does not talk about immigration status. It talks about counting the total number of people, right? And so in thinking about how we actually get people to respond, how do we get people to know what the census is, understand what it determines, and then actually get them to take the action to participate, this context is extremely important. And so that's what I would ask all of you to be thinking about as you embark on this journey.
Ahmed, thank you so much. And now I'd like to ask Professor Smith to talk about how his teaching and research interacts and his ideas with the census and the challenges and constraints we've heard, and your ideas for how students and members of the Columbia community can respond to these challenges.
Thank you. So my name is Brian Smith, and this semester I'm teaching user interface design, which is a computer science class, but you don't have to be a computer science student to take it. The class essentially aims to teach students, the way I like to put it, is how to engineer usefulness and usability in interactive systems. And so key to that is usefulness and usability to end users. But I'd like to highlight two other terms in that phrase, engineer and interactive systems. And so first, regarding engineering usefulness and usability, the whole point is that design is a process that anyone can do and that anyone can accomplish as long as they have the discipline and the empathy for the people that really matter, namely the end users, or in this case, the people that need to be counted. And then second is interactive systems. And so through my class, I hope to teach students that that user interfaces, user interface design is actually very, very broad. It's not just about software tools. It's about any kind of systems that people interact with, ranging from architecture, buildings that people move around and have to accomplish tasks in, to public policy and law and all of these other systems that actually affect people's lives. And for students to see user interfaces as really being mediums or intermediaries to gaining new abilities or gaining new powers or accomplishing things that they'd like in their life. And so that's how I'd like to fold what I'm teaching in the class into this design challenge. So basically, making sure that the end users, mainly the population of New York City, are counted, and being able to go through a design process in order to make that happen. And so logistically, I'm going to have a final project in my class with groups of 3 or 4 students. We will be covering the design process along the way. So not only will groups help tackle the challenge, but they will also learn about the design process and user interfaces. And the goal is to really treat this challenge as an accessibility issue. I also do research in accessibility and making computers and other tools more accessible to, for example, people who are blind. And so that's the sort of direction that I'd like to take, at least with my course.
Thank you. And Professor Chilton?
Yeah, so I teach the advanced web design studio class. After you take Brian's class, you can take my class. I also teach 4170 in the spring. And it's about applying those principles to make an impact in people's lives. And we really focus on not solving big, intractable problems, but defining something local with people you can reach out, talk to, learn about, interview, to have them test something that you're doing, to see that, be in that feedback loop. It's all, you're not going to have the answer from the outright. The goal is to be embedded in a community where you can continually see, would this work? Would that work? What's their response to this? What's their response to that? A lot of that about learning more about your customers and clients, what their goals are, and not having them do what you want, but helping them do what they want to do. So it's really about how to turn it around and be able to design something truly for somebody else. If you have insight into that process from having been in that situation, that's great. But if not, you can still learn what other people's experience is. And then Harry and I are going to be co-teaching a seminar that anyone can take who's interested in this. And I'll let you talk about it.
Thanks. So there's a slight change from what was presented a few seconds ago. So I do teach an introduction to human-centered design class, but we thought about it and we decided that I was going to take that out of this program and create a new class, which we did yesterday. I did not know it was physically possible to create a new class in 24 hours, but we did. So, and I don't even know what it's called, but you can look it up. So we want to, and I'm going to be working very closely with Lydia. We're going to co-teach this class. We want to bring a human-centered design approach to this particular challenge because we think that the most important stakeholders in the census are the people being counted. And so we want to develop ways so that you can work with the people being counted and work with them to together create better ways so that more people are counted. We'll be introducing co-creation or participatory design techniques into this program. And together, we want to increase the participation in the census, particularly amongst underrepresented communities, because as has been pointed out several times, that is where the problem is particularly acute. So why did we set up a seminar? Because we thought that this is such an important problem that we should have specific focus on this problem. And also because our dean pointed out that sometimes this class, this challenge can be a stress for students. So we thought that it would reduce stress for students if we provided a structure and also gave you the opportunity to get credit for working on the challenge. So we're going to meet weekly, probably, I think, Friday, 10 to 1, I think. And we think we have a room in computer science. And we're going to offer 3 credits for this. And Lydia and I are going to, you're going to have to do the work, okay? But we're going to coach you through the process. We're going to share some of the techniques that we know how to do that. But we're also actually going to be co-creating this class with you along the way. And it is open to everybody in Columbia, graduate, undergraduate, and any school.
Brilliant.
Okay. Yes, it's up to you, okay? But if it helps, you can have 3. If you prefer not to, that's okay too.
That is...
Yes. Oh my gosh, you're asking. I've been on the faculty 6 days now, and okay, but you tell me. Okay.
That is amazing co-creation. So the students are co-creating the class with you, including their number of credits.
I think so. Yes.
And also their grades. I'll let you set that later. So, as a testament to the, exactly, I was going to say just-in-time course development. Yes, and my relationship with Columbia goes back 30 years, and I just went in a meeting 2 days ago, and I was like, there's no way you can create a class in 1 day, and behold and lo, somehow you did it, so well done. As Professor West mentioned, we are the coaches. We are here to co-create solutions with the Columbia community, in particular the students, and so I'd like to open the floor to questions from the students and faculty who are here. Before I do that, I want to give Amit and our other faculty and the faculty on the panel a chance to elaborate on anything, or are there questions that came up during the other comments? Ivy? Yes. Yes, and as a professor of applied mathematics, I teach the seminar in applied mathematics, APMA 4901, 4903. If you're a junior, you're taking 4901. If you're a senior, you're taking 4903. That is very much a flipped classroom in which I work with the students to create solutions to problems. And so this year we're going to have a special emphasis on the census, and several of the groups, several of the students have already indicated that they're interested in working on census as their problem. So we will be working together. We haven't mentioned supervised research, but most departments have on the book a supervised research class. So for applied math, that's APMA 3900. I say that in case you're an applied mathematician or if you'd like to take it. But look for a supervised research class on the books in whatever department you like. And there's probably a faculty member who's going to be excited to work with you on a supervised research project. I guess another thing to say is temporarily we've focused on the fall as the design challenge, but the census goes live in the spring. I reckon there's going to be plenty of challenges in the spring as well. So let's think about what all the work we can do during the fall, but there's going to be plenty to do over the winter and in the spring. And as Professor Wing mentioned, also, once you have the data set, that's not the end of your challenges in your relationship with the data set, including differential privacy and the way those data are used for good. Any other follow-up comments from any of the panelists? Good. Please.
So I imagine the teams of students are we will be working with. So Julie Menon is the lead for the city on this and is really behind us on this. We've also working with the census office, which, as I said, is blocks away. We have Ahmed here as well. So the sense is the sense is not the census. The sense is that depending on how things develop, some of the projects will be taken to implementation. Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, it could very well, and but we don't want to promise too much, but we could definitely imagine that. Just so it's time for you to ask questions, but I'm just going to point out something I just found out. So because I said every talk there's still only 10 questions. What are the 10 questions? Yeah. So we have a problem already because when you Google what are the 10 questions, what comes up most is that the U.S. citizen question is not on the census. So instead of coming up with the top hits being what are the 10 questions, which is what I asked, you come up with, and I had to dig a little bit to actually find the site that gives what the 10 questions are. What comes up is that the U.S. citizenship question is not going to be on it, and here's all the stuff around the U.S. citizenship question. So it's kind of, that's kind of an interesting problem right there. But I don't want to, I want to open it up to the floor, so sorry. Right, of course.
That is fantastic user experience research that just happened. Yes, that's what it's called in the business. And Professor Wing, I also just had a phone call with Justin Hendricks yesterday from New York City Media Lab, so we're planning a special census-oriented event after the term, so there'll be opportunities to show off what people have made and make sure it's socialized. You're absolutely right. New York City, as Professor Ken Jackson said years ago, is a fantastic laboratory for humanity. The problems that humanity has, we have here first. So it's not the case that the problems are limited to New York City. Columbia professor Ken Jackson, but that the solutions we create here, co-create here, we hope will help the entire country and all of humanity. Questions from the audience, please.
So this might be a bit of a narrow question, but like this is a design challenge. But like, what exactly are we like going to be designing? Because like obviously the census is on. I know it's probably broad what we can do, but are you guys thinking like advertising, like get out the count? What's sort of the scope?
We've been pretty broad about that. I mean, wearing my hat as an applied mathematician, there are abundant data available for each of the census tracts and how they've responded in the past. There's essentially an infinite amount of exploratory data analysis one can do on those data alone, better to understand where we might devote our resources to getting out the count, as well as developing interpretable models about why those different census tracts might respond differentially, which can inform our efforts to get out the count and get an accurate count. Mark presented a bunch of data visualization challenges. Julie mentioned how that data visualization is one part of education and inoculation against disinformation. Those are some things that come to mind for me immediately in terms of data-driven solutions. And you're right, she also mentioned advertising. Once you have ads to get out the vote, once you have that, you have digital advertising, which means for better or worse, you have abundant data about how people engage with different messages. But that's just off the top of my head. Maybe the panelists.
Yeah, I'll add to that one of the things in a design challenge is defining the problem is like 90% of the problem. And I know that's a frustrating answer, but one way to think of it is there's many different stakeholders and people, and they all have an environment that they're working in. So like there's the enumerators. What are the people that go knock on the last 1% of people's door? What are their challenges? Do they need to connect, communicate to each other? They're going to be picked locally. Like how do we know and advertise that? So yeah, advertising's a part of it, but also local awareness and news stories. Mark had a couple of great examples of news stories for local communities saying it mattered that we filled out the census. And we could find for every community a concrete thing that community cares about that filling out the census would give money toward. Maybe this community cares about their hospital or their school district, and that's something that so like making these abstract things more concrete and valuable to the actual people that have to fill out the form. So they're all different sorts of people, communities, leaders, families, people on the ground, kids. There's just so many different people, and they'll all have a different perspective on it. And the first role is to go and find out what's out there. Anything to add to that?
Sure, not wanting to pile on, but one of the joys of design is that you're constantly surprised by new ideas. And I have no idea what you're going to come up with. I think you should not feel constrained, as long as it's legal, okay, and fair. Then I think it's legit.
If I miss kids under 5, 200 million. Why? Not sure in the Census Bureau. Sits there as target of opportunity.
So again.
So if I could just add to that, I mean, you raise a really good point, and you asked a really good question about what is the end product that we're producing here, right? So our office, our primary goal is to actually create a number of these end products so that we are ensuring that folks are actually participating in the census. I'm sure Julie mentioned one of the things that we're going to be doing is running a multi-million-dollar advertising and marketing campaign. That's not only going to be broad in that we have to obviously target all New Yorkers to make them aware of the importance of it, but it also has to be very targeted, right? And so to that end, and I apologize that I speak from a qualitative perspective to a very quantitative group of people, but we've already started conducting a number of focus groups with various different constituencies to understand what are the elements of society and of life, as Professor Chilton was mentioning, that are important to them, right? Because if we can start to tie the importance of the census very specifically to what they find important, and through a combination of both paid media and what we call earned media, which are the stories that you were mentioning, start to communicate with communities that the census actually plays a role in determining funding for certain types of programs that they can actually identify or see in their neighborhoods or have benefited from in some ways, that the that the census determines political representation for their communities, right? That it determines not only political representation in Washington, but in fact, census numbers are also used to draw lines for city council, state assemblies, and state senate districts, which is our representation both at City Hall and in Albany, right? Starting to get people to understand that the census is the one exercise that informs all of these things that have a direct impact on your life is really what we are trying to do. And so working off of the focus groups that we have already conducted, we will be conducting more of them. We will be using the information that we learn to inform and influence how we speak different communities in different ways and what are the different messages that we emphasize at different times.
Sounds like a fantastic data set, qualitative and quantitative data set, the result of a focus group. That reminds me, Ken, we were talking before about some new surveys that are going to be going online. Is that going to be a source of data?
One of the things that I should, advertising campaign that's a big one by Young and Rubicon is really not based on social media. It's a standard, conventional TV, newspaper, and so forth. So there's a big gap out there in the advertising world if you think of how many people get their stuff from social media. The issue I was talking about, but it's really been covered, is that we're doing some focus groups right now with what we know to be problematic groups. Where you've got the Islamic population, the Muslim population, and so forth and so forth. I'll give you one anecdote from that. There was a man there in the focus group who said, "I'm never going to cooperate with this census. I don't believe in it." This focus group was on for 2 hours, and in the process of those 2 hours, you keep giving reasons like, guess what? You got a VA hospital, you care about it, and so he goes up to say, "Well, okay. My chances I'll do it are now 20%. On, and it goes up to 60%. Goes on, and he gets into the 80. Maybe I'll really do it. Then they handed him the questionnaire. Never seen it. Put it down and said, "I'm not going to cooperate at all." The reason is it has a race question on it. And he interprets the race question now through the lens of the citizenship immigration debate. He says, why do I want the country to know? Why am I'm just not going to answer that question. So that's a focus group finding, which we never would have imagined. The racial groups have their own dynamic and so forth. I haven't heard mentioned just one, sorry, well, that's mine. The churches are enormously important. Talk about trusted voices. If you get the ministers, the priests, to kind of create a message out there on their own that comes from their voice, you've done a huge.
Absolutely. It speaks to institutions with a civic function. Now, I am as guilty as any other faculty member in that if you ask me a question, I will just start professing. So we may only have time for 1 or 2 questions, but I'd love to hear more from other students and other members of the community. Please.
I was wondering if we could talk about sort of what the impact of being unresponsive was. Statistically, we have to account for the unresponsive rate. So ideally, we would already have a proportionate number. So we're trying to convey sort of what the impact of being more responsive is, knowing that we already account for the numbers. What is really the difference? Like, is it just constraining our confidence intervals?
That's actually deeply contested whether or not we are allowed to account for it. And Mark is gone, but actually that's what the lawsuit was about when Mark was a graduate student. So when Mark said he was part of a lawsuit with the great statistical giants, like John Tukey and Bryman, like battling each other, it was about establishing whether or not you were allowed to account for it. And that itself has for decades broken down on partisan lines because, again, there are partisan implications as to whether or not you inflate, even if you could calibrate, whether or not whether or not the best calibration is allowed is actually debated and struck down. So we are not allowed. So although
There is some accounting for it.
There is a current belief that there is an undercount.
Oh yes.
Okay.
Oh yes. Yeah.
No, but many things happen. one of which is that you go to the neighbors and you ask the neighbors and so forth. Then we have an imputation process. For what is the likely characteristic of this household from which we cannot get a response? And so we do that statistically. We do then knock on doors. The enumerators that are going out knocking on the doors where we don't get counts. There are half a dozen different procedures that kick in once it's clear the mailback or the internet response drops off. That's the real crisis. If it drops off at 50% and you're coming on and dropping off at 60%, we have a huge, huge budget hole in the census. They don't have enough money to find the extra people and extra processes that you need to make up for that. So pushing up the initial response rate is critically important from a resource point of view.
And just if I may,
Please,
for
of course.
a very quick second, you asked about what is the specific impact and how do we convey that to people. So just to bring it home to New York City, and of course with all due respect to Mr. Pruitt and his operation in the past, we had a particular issue. Can you hear me? I prefer to not use the mic if that's right. Was that recording? Oh, for recording. Sorry. We had a particular issue in New York City.
In 2010, where, and I don't know how many of you are actually from the New York City area, and certainly you were probably too young to remember this, but anyone who's been in and around New York City for 15, 20 years knows that the western part of Queens, Astoria, Long Island City, etc., has experienced an enormous population boom. It is very evident from the fact that we have dozens of skyscrapers where there used to be nothing but one-story factories, that rents are above $4,000, you name it, right? And in the 2010 census, because of a variety of issues, the numbers essentially showed that in Astoria and Long Island City and parts of southern Brooklyn, if you took the numbers collectively, that we had a 500,000 person population drop, which makes absolutely no sense. And as a result of that undercount, when you think about this average size of a congressional district in the United States, which is 650,000 people, you essentially lost almost an entire congressional district's worth of people. Now, what does it mean to lose a congressional district? It means to lose a significant amount of power and representation in Washington. And you know, I'm not suggesting that New York City necessarily lost a congressional district as a result of that. There are many factors that go into this, and obviously, you know, population increase in one place is only relative to a population decrease in another place, et cetera. But really, that's how we need to think about it, right? That when we have an undercount, we are literally rendering ourselves invisible. And in doing so, it's as though we don't exist. So there is a real implication here.
Thank you, Amit. My prediction is that it will take us a few minutes to vacate this room in order to satisfy the educational mission of the university and bring in a new class. That said, I believe that there's sort of an after party scheduled after that. Ivy, is that accurate?
That's accurate.
Okay.
Do you have any other closing statements?
Only to thank all of you and Ivy is going to explain the details of the after party.